The city bus was packed, as it always was during rush hour. People squeezed together, shoulder to shoulder, some standing, some clinging to the metal poles to steady themselves. The air was thick with the hum of chatter, the rustling of bags, and the occasional sharp sound of a phone's ringtone. It was the kind of bus ride that made everyone long for their destination, hoping the trip would end quickly. Near the front of the bus, a middle-aged man stood, leaning on a cane for support. His faded military jacket clung to his frame, its once vibrant colors now muted with time. His posture was straight, but there was a tiredness in his eyes, a weariness that spoke of years of service and countless battles fought. He was not young anymore, and the effort it took to stand on the swaying bus seemed to weigh heavily on him. Yet there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. Despite his struggle, his pride remained intact. A few feet away from him, a young man sat, his headphones firmly in place, blocking out the world around him. He was oblivious to the man's presence, to the crowd, and even to the fact that the bus was so full that others were having to stand. The teen was dressed in the latest fashion, expensive clothes, a designer jacket, and sneakers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His eyes were half closed, lost in the music blaring through his headphones, and he didn't seem to care about anything or anyone else. The veteran's cane tapped the floor softly as he shifted his weight, trying to find a more comfortable position. His eyes scanned the bus, looking for someone who might offer him a seat. But the bus was packed, too many people standing, too few seats available. He moved a little closer to the teen, hoping he might offer him the seat. The contrast between the two could not have been more striking. The veteran, worn by years of life's trials, stood with quiet grace. The teen, with his air of entitlement, sat back, as if the world owed him something. As the bus rocked gently, the veteran's cane slipped slightly, and his grip tightened as he tried to steady himself. It was clear that standing for much longer would be a challenge. The bus rumbled on, but in that moment, the space between the veteran and the teen felt as vast as the world itself. The veteran took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his years pressing against him. With a slight shuffle of his feet, he moved toward the young man sitting in the seat. His cane tapped the floor softly as he approached, his face kind but tired. He didn't want to make a scene, but the strain on his legs was becoming too much. "Excuse me, young man," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I'm sorry to bother you, but would you mind if I took your seat? I'm a bit older, and standing's become a bit difficult for me these days." The young man didn't even look up from his phone at first. His fingers continued to swipe over the screen, his music blaring so loudly that it was nearly audible to the people around him. After a moment, he pulled one headphone out, giving the veteran a brief glance, as if the request wasn't even worth his full attention. He sighed dramatically before responding, his tone dismissive. "Are you serious?" The teen's voice was sharp, laced with a hint of arrogance. "I've had a long day too. I'm tired, okay? I'm not giving up my seat just because you're older." The veteran stood there for a moment, his expression unchanged but his heart sinking a little. He had expected a refusal. After all, this was the world he had come to know. But the teen's words stung more than he had anticipated. His fingers tightened around the handle of his cane, but he didn't raise his voice. His posture remained upright, though the effort was visible now, beads of sweat forming along his brow. The surrounding passengers had begun to notice the exchange. Some shifted uncomfortably in their spots, avoiding eye contact with both the veteran and the teen. Others subtly exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. A woman standing nearby looked around, clearly torn between the urge to say something and the fear of making things worse. She stole a glance at the veteran's face, noticing the quiet hurt in his eyes. The veteran wasn't asking for special treatment. He just needed a moment of relief. The young man shrugged as if it was no big deal and turned his attention back to his phone, tapping away at the screen like nothing had happened. The people around them remained silent, most of them too afraid to intervene. A few muttered under their breath, shaking their heads at the teen's rudeness. The tension on the bus was palpable, thick enough to cut through the murmur of the crowd. The veteran's face softened with a mixture of disappointment and quiet hurt. His mind briefly wandered back to the days when respect for elders was just a given, when younger generations knew the value of offering kindness to those who had served or simply lived longer. But now, the world felt different. Colder. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to cause trouble for anyone, but the pain in his knees and the ache in his back were real. His thoughts swirled, but he remained calm, simply nodding. "I understand," he said quietly, stepping back slightly, though his gaze lingered on the teen for a brief moment. He didn't say another word, but the disappointment was there, like a weight in the air, heavy and unspoken. The bus continued its slow, rattling journey through the city, but now the atmosphere was charged. People glanced nervously between the young man and the veteran, unsure of how to feel. Whispers filled the bus, some expressing discomfort, others wondering why no one had said anything. The veteran stood there, still clutching his cane, his gaze fixed forward as the bus rattled on. Despite the crowd around him, the veteran couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. The world had changed. As the tension in the bus thickened, a woman sitting a few rows behind the teen couldn't take it any longer. She had been watching the exchange between the veteran and the teenager, her heart growing heavier with each passing moment. The veteran's polite request, the teenager's dismissive attitude, it was too much for her to ignore. She was a bit older herself, but she wasn't going to stand by and let this happen without doing something. With a sigh, she stood up from her seat. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but there was a fire in her eyes. She glanced around, her gaze briefly meeting the veteran's. Without a word, she walked toward him, offering her seat with a warm, understanding smile. "Sir," she said gently, "please, take my seat. You deserve to rest." The veteran looked at her for a moment, surprised by the kind offer. But as soon as he saw her face, the years of experience with kindness and hardship reflected in her eyes, he knew he couldn't refuse. Still, he hesitated. He didn't want to cause trouble, didn't want to make the situation any worse. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I don't want to trouble you. I'm fine, really, just don't want to make a scene." The woman's heart broke at the sight of the veteran's quiet dignity. She understood his reluctance, but she wasn't going to let this moment pass without standing up for what was right. However, before she could insist, the teen let out a scoff, breaking the silence. "Oh, here we go," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The hero complex. You're not even a hero, lady. You're too old to be a hero, so just sit back down." The words struck like a slap, cutting through the already tense atmosphere. The woman froze for a moment, her face flushed with a mix of disbelief and anger. But before she could respond, a man sitting across from the teen stood up, his expression sharp with disapproval. "You've got some nerve, kid," the man said, his voice rising above the murmurs of the other passengers. "How can you be so disrespectful to someone who served their country? People like him are the reason you have the freedom to act like this." The bus went completely silent for a moment, as if everyone was holding their breath. The man's words echoed through the bus, and several passengers shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously at the teen. The teen's face reddened, but he didn't say a word in response. His defiant attitude had started to crack. The veteran, though, stood quietly, a faint but visible expression of gratitude crossing his face. His eyes flicked to the man who had spoken up, then back to the teenager, who was now fidgeting nervously in his seat. But the pressure in the air was palpable. The bus had become a ticking time bomb, filled with a simmering tension. Passengers exchanged glances, some in disbelief at the teenager's behavior, others in anger at his disrespect. The woman who had offered her seat stood back, her eyes fixed on the teen, waiting for some kind of reaction, some form of acknowledgement, but the teen didn't say anything. He looked around as if the entire bus was suddenly closing in on him, the uncomfortable whispers of his fellow passengers settling heavily on his shoulders. The bus came to a sudden halt, jerking everyone forward. The abrupt stop caused a ripple of discomfort as the passengers shifted in place, some grabbing for poles to steady themselves. A few groans filled the air as people straightened up, muttering about the inconvenience. The doors of the bus opened, and a new passenger stepped on, an officer in full uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that immediately quieted the murmur of the bus. But it wasn't just his uniform that caught people's attention. It was the look of recognition on his face as his eyes scanned the crowd. The veteran, still standing with his cane, didn't notice the officer at first. He was lost in thought, looking out the window as the tension from the earlier exchange still weighed heavily on him. But as the officer made his way down the aisle, his gaze landed on the veteran, and his eyes lit up. "Tom," the officer called out with a warm smile. His voice was loud enough to carry, drawing the attention of everyone in the bus. "Tom Davis. I didn't know you still took the bus, my friend. It's good to see you." The entire bus fell silent. Every passenger turned their head, eyes flicking between the officer and the veteran. The atmosphere shifted from awkward tension to quiet curiosity. The officer walked toward the veteran with a familiarity that made it clear they had known each other for a long time. The young man, still sitting with his headphones dangling loosely around his neck, looked confused. He glanced at the officer, then at the veteran, but the recognition in the air was palpable. The officer stood before the veteran, giving him a respectful nod. "Do you know who this is?" the officer asked, his gaze sweeping over the rest of the passengers, but focusing on the teen sitting nearby. The words cut through the tense silence, making everyone hold their breath. The young man blinked, still unsure. Just some old guy." The officer's face hardened, but only for a moment. A faint, proud smile crossed the veteran's face as he looked at the young man, his eyes betraying the weight of years long past. He didn't need to say anything, but the officer wasn't done yet. "Tom Davis," the officer repeated, his voice growing firmer, "served in the Vietnam War. He was a hero, not just for his country, but for this entire community. After his service, he came back and spent years working with troubled youth, helping kids just like you find their way. He's done more for this city than you'll ever understand." A few passengers exchanged looks of shock, others leaning forward, trying to catch every word. The teenager's face paled as he slowly began to grasp the magnitude of the situation. The man who had stood there with a cane, asking for nothing but a little kindness, was far more than just an old guy. He was someone who had given so much of himself, not only serving his country, but continuing to give back long after the war had ended. The officer stepped a little closer to the teen, his voice calm but unwavering. "So the next time you think about disrespecting someone, especially someone like Tom, you better think again. You owe him and all veterans respect, and you'd better show it." The words hit harder than any slap. The bus remained silent as the officer's final words hung in the air, his gaze locked on the teen. The veteran, though still standing, gave a small, humble smile as if to say, "It's okay. No need to make a bigger fuss." The teen's face flushed red, his confidence suddenly gone. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced around, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. Eyes filled with judgment, eyes that had been watching his arrogance and disrespect. For the first time since the incident began, he felt the full gravity of what he had done. The officer gave the teen one last look before turning back to the veteran, offering a hand to help him sit. "Take a seat, Tom," the officer said, his voice gentle now, the air around them shifting from confrontation to quiet respect. The veteran nodded, the years of life and service behind him shining through in that simple gesture. He sat down slowly, his body sagging with the relief of finally resting. As he did, the passengers who had been watching exchanged glances, their expressions softening. The mood of the bus had changed, and the teen sat frozen in his seat, finally understanding the weight of what had just happened. The teen's face was a mixture of shame and disbelief, the reality of his actions sinking in with every passing second. His hands trembled as he stood up from his seat, his eyes darting around the bus, catching the curious and judgmental gazes of the passengers. He swallowed hard, and his voice cracked as he spoke, barely above a whisper. "Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't realize who you were. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I didn't think." His words trailed off, the weight of his apology hanging in the air, thick and genuine. The veteran, sitting in the now vacant seat, looked up at the teen, his expression calm and understanding. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness, just the quiet wisdom that came from years of experience. He nodded slowly, his voice soft but firm. "It's all right, son," the veteran said, his words like a balm to the teen's raw conscience. "Respect. It's something everyone has to learn. It's not about being perfect. It's about recognizing the value in others, especially those who came before you. His voice trembled slightly, but there was no sign of resentment, only quiet grace. The teen stood there for a moment longer, visibly shaken, before nodding and stepping back, his head lowered in quiet contrition. Without saying another word, he made his way to the door, the weight of the situation too heavy for him to bear any longer. The doors of the bus opened once again, and he stepped off, leaving behind an atmosphere that had shifted from tension to reflection. The veteran sighed deeply as he sank further into the seat, his body finally able to relax after standing for so long. The bus was quieter now, the earlier tension having dissipated. The passengers, once tense and unsure of how to react, now exchanged glances of understanding. A few nodded toward the veteran in silent respect, their eyes filled with acknowledgement of what had just transpired. The woman who had offered her seat smiled softly at him, as did the man who had stood up for him earlier. The officer standing near the door turned to the veteran with a nod. "Thank you for your service, Tom," he said, his voice full of respect. "You've done more than most people ever will." The veteran smiled faintly, the lines of his face softening as he nodded in return. "Thank you, officer. It's been a long road." The bus doors closed, and the vehicle continued on its path through the city. The atmosphere was no longer charged with tension. The whispers had died down, and a peaceful silence settled over the passengers. It was a quiet moment of reflection, a moment where people realized that sometimes it takes something as small as a bus ride to remind us of the importance of respect, humility, and learning from our mistakes. As the bus rumbled down the road, its journey no longer interrupted by tension, a quiet truth lingered in the air, a reminder of the power of small moments. A simple interaction, a moment of discomfort, could sometimes be enough to change the course of someone's thinking, to open their eyes to something they hadn't understood before. It wasn't about grand gestures or heroic acts. Sometimes all it took was one person standing up for what was right, one person offering a hand, or one person realizing that respect is something everyone needs to learn. The veteran, with his quiet dignity, hadn't demanded anything. He had simply asked for kindness. And the teen, once too absorbed in his own world, had been forced to see beyond his arrogance. In the end, the veteran's actions weren't about teaching a lesson. They were about reminding everyone of the values that truly matter. Respect, empathy, understanding, these are things that cannot be given to us, but must be earned through our actions and how we treat others. And even though the teen had faltered at first, the story didn't end with his mistake. His apology, sincere and hesitant, spoke to the possibility of change. It was never too late to realize the gravity of our actions, to reflect on the lessons life gives us in unexpected places. In the quiet that followed, as the bus continued its journey through the city, there was a sense of hope, a feeling that people could grow, could learn, and could make the world a little better, one small step at a time. It was a moment of personal growth, not just for the young man, but for everyone who had witnessed the exchange. And as the bus pulled into its final stop, the lesson lingered, leaving something for everyone to think about as they went on with their day. Thank you for watching this powerful story about respect, growth, and the small moments that can change our perspectives. It's a reminder that no matter where we are in life, we can always learn from our actions and make a positive impact on those around us. If this story moved you, we'd love for you to show your support. Please like, comment, and share this video with others who could benefit from this message. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new story that inspires and connects us all. Your support helps us keep creating stories that remind us of the power of kindness, understanding, and personal growth. Thank you again for being part of this journey.